you've transcended a liminal threshold into History Fuzz, a realm of contemplative inquiry in which leading researchers discuss the motivations, tools and skills of the skywatchers, surveyors, architects and builders who delineated monumental landscapes with awe-inspiring structures, enshrining their diverse cosmic chronicles in stone. I'm your host, Ashley Cowie. You can unlock videos, maps, articles, and enjoy early ad-free new episodes by becoming a member on historyfuzz.com, where you can also apply to join our team exploring and filming archaeology documentaries in the Andean highlands of Colombia. 18th century Freemasons believed medieval church architects in England oriented their buildings with the azimuth of sunrise on the day of the patronal saint. However, having spent over 10 years exploring the English countryside with a compass, Ian Hinton surveyed the alignments of over 2,000 rural churches, and his work thoroughly debunks this romantic Masonic notion. In this episode, Ian discusses the hidden complexities of church building, revealing a suite of Masonic secrets and myths. And after explaining why leylines are utter nonsense, Ian reveals how his database of alignments suggests changing weather and climate patterns were key factors in the orientation of English churches. So your 2006 work, Church Alignment and Patronal Saint Days, is based on the premise, the social archetype that medieval churches were aligned with where the sun rises on the horizon on the day of the dedicated saint. Could you outline your research methods when you approached that subject? I believe you used a data set of about 3,000 church alignments, is that right?
No, 2,000, just over 2,000.
Where did that data come from? I take it you didn't go and survey 2,000 churches.
Well, I did.
You did?
Yes, took 10 years. Most of which was I was assisted by my dear lady wife, who found places that you couldn't possibly imagine even existed all over the country. I started this as a short project looking at the churches around where I lived in the Waveney Valley, which is on the Norfolk-Suffolk border. Mm-hmm. It was for a diploma in landscape history that I was doing at the time. And in doing that, we then went away on holiday to Cumbria, and we looked at some churches in Cumbria, and the figures were apparently different between the two areas. So that sort of triggered the idea that there was perhaps some difference, either east-west or north-south across the country. So it's then a question of filling in other counties which fitted either the same latitude or the same longitude. And as for the churches I chose, once I'd moved away from the Waveney Valley, I looked at every church in the counties I looked at that Pevsner had described as not being rebuilt. So I was looking at churches that retained the alignment they were given when they were first built in stone.
How on earth do you begin to determine the alignment of a church when, for example, you have the phenomenon of the weeping chancel, where the alignment is not straight from the east to the west?
Yep.
How do you derive the intentional alignment?
I had a compass which had been certified to plus or minus 1 degree. It was fixed to a long piece of hardwood, which was pushed up against the church wall, the nave wall in several places, averaged. So if there was a difference caused by something like iron in the walls or something, I could filter those out. But I did that for nave and the chancel. And the difference between nave and chancel alignment did form quite a part of the research I was doing.
So Ian, you're saying that these are based on magnetic alignments?
No, that's how I measured them. I have no idea whether they were laid out magnetically. But the only way you can, it's the only direction you can get, isn't it? If you're looking at a church to see which way it's aligned, you can only assess it magnetically. Half the problem is that churches often aren't parallel walled. The walls aren't, so you have to take both sides anyway and then take an average of the whole lot. And the fact that about a quarter or a third of all churches, the chancel is aligned differently from the nave. So it was important to measure the two separately in order to be able to filter out those figures and look at them as a separate exercise.
Why did you do that, Ian? Why did this bother you? Why did you dedicate 10 years to figuring this out? What was the inspiration?
Now there's a question. I started off, oddly enough, I just moved to a small village in the Waveney Valley in 1997, and they were preparing a village history, and I got involved as being interested in that sort of thing. And I went to take some photographs of the two stained glass windows in the east wall of the two churches. There were two churches in the village, one at either end. And I got to the first one. The idea was to take the photograph from the inside with the sun coming through the east window, two very good stained glass windows. And got to the first church, and the sun was already shining on the south wall slightly. No problem. I took the photograph, moved to the other church at the other end of the village, and it took an hour and a half for the sun to get onto the south wall. So they were obviously aligned differently, and that intrigued me. And it turned out that they were 21 degrees differently aligned, and they're only a mile apart. So that set up all sorts of questions. How were they done? Why were they done? Whether there was any meaning to it. And it was then I started reading about the theory that churches were aligned on the day of their patronal saint. That's been researched many times in the last 150 years or so, with varying results, I have to say.
Have you ever determined where that myth originated? Where's the earliest record of the saints' alignment?
Initially, but when I first started reading it, I found it in the history of Freemasonry from 1859, which seemed a reasonable place, Masons, etc., etc. But then as you look deeper, you find that all they're doing is reiterating the words that Wordsworth used in his poem of 1823, when he was talking about the building of the chapel next door to where he lived in Rydal in Cumbria. A long, very wordy description of them apparently waiting for sunrise and then setting down the position for the altar in relation to the church. But that was merely a repeat of Silas Domville's words of 1678, where he wrote about churches being aligned on the day that they were set out with sunrise. So it appears to be the same idea that's just been regurgitated. And it's difficult to say how far back before that it goes, because certainly if you go back to William Durandus, the 13th century French papal aide, he found significance in everything in the church, whether they were the octagonal shape of the piers, the displays of the windows, but he never ever mentioned church alignment as being significant. So it obviously wasn't important then.
You brought up the Freemasons. I came across a record of the 1137 AD building of St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, and that is to within half a degree aligned to St. Stephen's Day. It's dedicated to St. Stephen on the 26th of December. Do you think there's a chance that that is coincidence? It was maybe a solstice alignment, perhaps? It's 4 days after the solstice. Do you think that's perhaps an intentional alignment, the 1137?
There are churches that do align with their sunrise. Only a few, but there are some. I'd be surprised if the church does align with sunrise on the 26th of December, because that's almost due southeast. And so that goes against what the church was saying at the time, that churches need to face east.
It's getting very close to what the church didn't like, which was the solstice alignment.
Yes, indeed. And also I'd want to check that measurement myself, because I've found a lot of the, especially Victorian church alignment studies, they ignored horizon elevation, and they ignored all sorts of things. They ignored Julian calendar dates. Their answers weren't in fact answers, because they fitted what they wanted it to fit.
Selective archaeology.
Very much so.
I just talked with Dr. Robert Barrett from the University of Belfast, and he has recently completed a study of the timber circles of Ireland. He took the classic astronomical equations book and he transferred that into modern coding and has created a program whereby you lay down all of your data, and what it does is it generates big data sets to show you where they fall in pie charts, so you can visualize them as graphs, if you like. Did you have any access to computers or digital technology to help you, or did you do all your research in an analog world?
Almost all of it's analog. I mean, I use spreadsheets and then data analysis on computers, but certainly no. And of course, all the things about calculating positions of sunrise on particular dates and all that sort of stuff using formulae and computers. But I certainly wouldn't want to use a pre-written ideas of where alignment should be. I mean, that seems to me to be going. That sort of idea is going rather back to the 60s when here's an alignment, it must mean something.
He's really refreshing in his approach. His conclusion from having measured the 22 temples in Malta built 3700 BC is that they are not astronomically aligned in some kind of pattern. He doesn't even think half of them have any astronomical intentionality, that it's more to do with centrality and the community temple. He, like you, has debunked all notions that there was some kind of underlying plan in the delineation of both the timber circles of Ireland and the Maltese temples. And coming back to your research, what was the results of your study? Could you break down what the actual data showed you?
First of all, there is no apparent difference in the mean alignment between any dedication of any church. So if you look at all the churches dedicated to St. Stephen or St. Andrew or All Saints, they all even out to about 86 degrees, something like that, just north of east.
Yeah.
They also have a similar range. Most of them are somewhere between 45 degrees and 125 degrees. So they're within almost all of them. Of the 1900 or 2100 I finally looked at, only 6 were outside the range of local sunrise. So they all relate to sunrise. But the fact that there's no difference between individuals when you total up all the churches seems to point to the fact that they were all aimed at the same thing rather than aimed at different things. I mean, if churches were aligned with sunrise on their saint's day, you'd expect them to vary a bit because of the way they were set out, but around the direction of sunrise rather than around east.
Having spoken to Professor Giulio Magli at the Politecnico in Milan about his work on the Khmer landscapes of Cambodia, he demonstrated that across a data set of about 90 temples in the same region, there was a propensity towards them being aligned between 2 and 4 degrees just to the north of east. As you say, 86, 87 degrees.
Really?
And I'll give you his reasoning, what he discovered, and you can perhaps put this in context of the English churches. The temple was aligned so that people standing to the west of the temple would see the sun rising above the temple. So the sun crowns the temples visually from the west. And I wonder, was there any architectural decisioning in England so that viewers outside the church, approaching the church from the west, would see the sunrise to the east?
But that will only occur on specific dates around the equinox.
Excuse me, this was an absolute focus on the equinox rise.
Yeah.
And not so much astronomically, so it's precisely at 90 on the horizon.
I understand the point, but I don't see why anything is why the equinox might be considered important. I can understand either of the solstices because you get the change in seasons, and the midwinter and midsummer are very important. Equinox is far less important because it doesn't show anything other than we're just about to go towards summer or towards winter. One of the early theories was that churches were aligned with sunrise at Easter, which is a fairly narrow band and about sort of 20 degrees north of east in this country. But even that doesn't really apply because if that was the case, you'd expect the mean alignment to be somewhere further north of east than it actually is.
Mm-hmm.
Sunrise at Easter, if Easter's on 22nd of March, is at 90 degrees roughly, and it's about 68 or 67 degrees on the 25th of April, which is the other extreme. So you'd expect it to be somewhere between the two, which it is, but it's really biased towards due east.
The obsession, if you like, with the equinox in Cambodia, similarly to here in Colombia, is because we're within 15 degrees of the equator. The equinox signifies the beginning of the rainy season, so it had huge cultural implications at that latitude. It's related to climatology, and it's amazing here on the 21st of March in Colombia, you start to hear the frogs amp up.
Really? Expecting the rain.
The first week of April, the mythology talks about it, the coming of Fu, the god of thunder, and the entire climate cracks on Easter week, and it's associated with Holy Friday, mythologically and in religions. In Khmer, Cambodia, there was a real obsession with cardinality. About the 9th century it began, and I just wondered if perhaps there was some kind of architectural sympathy towards the church in its environment, what the sun was doing looking at the church, rather than when the worship conducted within the church. But you don't see any signs of that.
No, not at all. In fact, I've had some interesting discussions with people at churches during the research when you explain what you're doing. And I had quite a heated discussion with a chap, not heated on my part, but he was insisting that his church faced sunrise on St. Peter's Day, which is when the church was dedicated, which is pretty close to midsummer, 29th of June. So we're talking about sunrise of about sort of 50 odd degrees, depending on where you are in the country here. But I showed him that the church was actually aligned at 85. And he said, oh yes, but when you stand at the end of the church, you can see sunrise on St. Peter's Day. So alignment to him meant 30 degrees different from looking out in a straight line from the end of the chancel. So it's far less exact. I mean, I'm not saying that perhaps the builders had the same, they must have had a better desire for accuracy, because they are on the whole much closer than that.
Referring again to Dr. Robert Barrett, the archaeoastronomers astronomers had disregarded the alignments within the Maltese temples because they were between 5 and 14 degrees off the solstice. However, he calculated that standing at the back of the temple and looking out the front portal, it actually covers a horizontal width of about 20 degrees. It's a 20-degree viewing slot.
Yeah.
And what he said is, it's equally as imbalanced to say there was no intentionality as there is to say there was exact intentionality, because he thinks that today's standards of accuracy shouldn't be projected backwards, and that perhaps it wasn't the solstice sunrise that was important, but it was the period of time between November and February. That's what was important. And perhaps in the church alignments too, they aren't aligned with intentionality of 1 degree, but perhaps slacker and maybe more sympathetic to what the foreground was doing. There must have been awareness to what these front eastern horizons were doing. Surely the architects must have monitored, perhaps there's a notch on a hill or a river where the sun may reflect on. Wouldn't they slightly align to account for romantic notions in the positioning of the church?
We seem to be back to Aubrey Burl again.
I don't want to go there. I debunk the guy at every turn. But there are human intentions in this.
Yes, I understand that. But the problem is that all the churches are, the mean alignment is 86 degrees, but the variation is actually 90 degrees. It's a complete quarter of the horizon, and which seems to fit in nicely with the idea that the second coming was going to come from the east, therefore you need to face east, which is why burials are with the head to the west, so that when they sit up, they're looking east. And that also reflects in the churches I found built on east-facing slopes. That could have been done for a similar reason, the fact that east is the focus. And I don't think it mattered exactly how accurately you were facing east, but you were facing eastwards.
Yeah.
Certainly most of the work I've done and work other people have done have determined that it was unlikely that a compass was used when setting out a rural church, because they didn't have such things. This first I've found mentioned in the church is in 1180 something, which is, by then most churches were already set out. So how were they set out? Did somebody work out where the equinox was? Did they work out where south was and then compute where east was? Does that explain the inaccuracy?
Mm-hmm.
Did people realise how much change there is when you elevate the horizon, how much it deflects sunrise further south? I mean, that was the fault with a lot of the Victorian research, the fact that they ignored that. And in fact, a 3-degree horizon pushes the sunrise 4.5 degrees further south, which is a week around the equinox, but several weeks around the solstices.
Did you ever find any signs of strings of churches following a similar alignment? And I'm not in any ways wanting to discuss bullshit such as the St. Michael's line or anything to do with that. We're beyond that. But
Leylines.
there certainly are in other landscapes I've discussed with professors evidence of adherence to projected alignments from key churches or temples, rather. Have you seen anything?
No. The short answer. In fact, my PhD supervisor, Tom Williamson, wrote the book that debunked ley lines completely.
What was his name?
Tom Williamson. Unfortunately, he's got motor neuron disease, so he's not really. I'm sure he'd be delighted to talk to you, but whether you could understand him at the moment, I don't know. But
I'm in my 20s, admittedly, was all about it.
Yeah.
I was in the northeast coast of Scotland, dousing rods out.
Me too.
But believing that I was in some ways an integral part of this unseen. And then you get to your 30s and you start questioning, hang on a second, if I'm so important in this ancient system, surely this is based more on ego than fact.
Yes, I mean, the 1960s and 70s were a great time to go out and go out with a joint and a compass and have fun in the landscape, which it was. And it was, as you say, it was a nice feeling that you were actually part of something, but you then realise that it can't be true. Because churches weren't built as a sequence. They were locally built by the local lord of the manor. He has no connection to the neighbouring lord of the manor who would build his own church.
Absolutely.
So there can't be any connection in that. I mean, what I did find initially was comparing the churches in the Waveney Valley in East Anglia to those in Cumbria. There was a difference in mean alignment. So it was then a question of finding out whether that alignment difference actually had any meaning, and if so, could it be explained by anything?
What was it?
What was it?
What do you think it was?
Oddly enough, I think it's something to do with climate and weather variations across the country, which produced the difference between climate and weather has a significant effect on when harvest was. So I looked at 3,500 harvest festival dates in some parts of the country that I'd researched the churches on the basis that the Victorian climate was considered by climate experts to be similar to the 11th century climate in terms of slightly warmer, slightly wetter than it was in the interim period. So looking at harvest festival dates, oddly enough, Cumbria often has earlier harvests than does East Anglia. All the West Country, all the way Cornwall, Pembroke, Somerset, they all have early harvests. East Anglia has very, very few.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Because of the climate of brought over from the North Sea. I mean, were you aware of the beast from the east in 2018? A winter storm that went on right to the end of March. But the point is that if that affects your harvest, we do get quite late frosts here still, which you don't seem to get in the West Country. And I wonder whether an early harvest would be a time for the Lord of the Manor to celebrate, to build his first church in 923 or whenever it was, because his harvest was 3 weeks earlier than the previous year, which meant a good harvest. It meant you went through the winter okay, your animals survived, all the other things that having food stores and stocks actually means for you.
You think that the weather has an impact on localized church alignments more so than any kind of underlying grand plan?
Yes, I'm pretty sure. I mean, as I said, there was no church building plan other than right at the top amongst the king and the senior thanes. All the rest of the churches were commercial exercises. Your local lord of the manor built a church so that he could collect the tithes. Once you built the church, your estate workers have to go to your church. You can get 10% of everything they produce. Okay, you have to fund the church and you have to fund the priest and all the rest of it, but it's an income.
Brings wider benefits as well.
It does, and that's recognised in the Doomsday Book, because churches were a taxable resource, which is why they're mentioned in the Little Doomsday Book in East Anglia much more than the main one. But they weren't built as centrally controlled religious institutions. They were built as private enterprise, effectively. They were later taken under the wing of the central church.
And you're thinking, so that 10-degree variation from east to west can be associated or attributed to climate?
To the difference between climate and weather. Climate gives you the earlier harvests normally in the south of the country, but local weather changes so dramatically, or can change so dramatically between one year and the next. I mean, some of the harvests I was looking at in Cumbria were happening towards the end of August, and others were never even fully gathered in by November. So there was a huge range in harvest dates. So an early one, I think, is a good reason to celebrate, especially if it's 1 in 20 or 1 in 30 or something like that.
Okay, so regarding the modern Christian calendar, the idea that the harvest festival, Shamain, or Halloween as we know it today, is the 1st of November. There was no evidence of churches being aligned to that date. There's no groupings around the quarters or the octants of the year as such. You think these churches in more so were aligned to local circumstances rather than a greater Christian calendar?
Yes, definitely. I mean, the fact that every single different church dedication has a mean alignment within a degree or two of 86 degrees shows that there certainly wasn't any other idea than just focusing eastwards. And I don't think if there was a focus towards Halloween or a focus towards midsummer or any other particular date, then you'd find variation around that date rather than around East. And it's not just the cancelling out of all the different saints' days, which are basically every day in the year has some saint being celebrated. So in theory, you could have cover the complete range, but then you'd expect to find St. Swithin, July the 14th, to be focused around a very northerly sunrise, and John the Evangelist and Christmas-based ones to be focused around southeast, but they're not. They're all focused around east.
About 25 years ago in Caithness, I got to thinking that perhaps the tradition of the Saints' Day alignment tradition perhaps came from the Chaldees monasteries, or perhaps the Augustinians, the massive abbey builders in Scotland. And I didn't do any kind of formal looking, but every time I looked at the alignment, I couldn't see any correlation, even in these great abbeys, from the Cistercians, the Chaldees, the Augustinians. There didn't seem to be anything there either. And what I did find was this, if anything, very often the Christian sites are beside water, beside a water source, which has, I suppose, obvious symbolic content, but where they were maybe 2 or 3 degrees off an optimum, what I would regard as an optimum or significant alignment, it was because there was maybe an unsightly, dark, shadowy part of the riverbank to the right, and they quite clearly just were like, hang on a minute, let's get... Yeah. You can see people knocking things off for very humanistic reasons rather than conforming to a grand plan.
There is one very good example of that, and that was at Rievaulx Abbey in Yorkshire.
Oh, yes.
The site wasn't big enough to fit it in the whole arrangement, so they turned it round almost 90 degrees and declared it ecclesiastical east. And it's almost 170 degrees it's aligned with, so it's almost due south.
Ecclesiastical east.
East. And I cannot find the reference to that now, unfortunately. I looked for it again this week, but I certainly remember reading that at the time I was doing the work, because other monasteries and large churches are aligned slightly differently, but that one is completely way off all the others.
Am I right in saying another term for what you just said is liturgical east?
Yeah, yes.
When I was researching, I found this liturgical east and west is a much debated concept in the orientation of churches.
Well, I see. I mean, I don't think East is much mentioned in the liturgy, but obviously the same. It's describing the same thing. It's describing a local solution to a problem. It seems
Yeah.
to me.
Let me tell you about an interesting alignment. You can give me a 1 to 10, 10 representing, hey Ash, that's great, and 0 representing, that is utter shite. Kenneth Brophy, a Doctor of Archaeology in Glasgow University, like you, like myself, totally rejects the idea of ley lines. However, what he did do over the last 4 or 5 years, they unfolded a box of research from a 1960s lay hunter known as Harry Bell. He famously published a work called Glasgow's Network of Secret Alignments. The lines look, like I said, of broken teeth, but when you zoom out long enough, when you come back far enough, it looks pretty straight.
It's called smoothing.
Smoothing, there you go, and it's like a magician's trick. It's like a piece of magic where you're hoaxing the person looking at this.
Yeah.
However, they found 1 or 2 significant Bronze Age and Iron Age alignments. This came up. 10 years ago, I met a researcher called Bob Bryden in Edinburgh. He is the keeper of the Scottish Gypsy collection, and he told me about an intentional church alignment, which is this. 1128, King David of Scotland founded Glasgow Cathedral, and Glasgow Cathedral's on the 55.67 latitude, and that was this Catholic power base of Scotland. 300 years later, just draw breath when I say this word, William Sinclair, the builder of Roslin Chapel in Edinburgh on the other side of the country, he decided to build a collegiate church and to try and centralise Catholic power in Edinburgh on the east. Mm-hmm. He not only visited the chaplain of Glasgow Cathedral, he brought his architects, and he built Roslin Chapel 80 miles to the east. The choir is an exact replication of the choir of Glasgow Cathedral, so in all of its parts, it is a mini Glasgow Cathedral. But what I found fascinating when I was looking at this is that it is within 130 metres variance on the same latitude as Glasgow Cathedral. Do you think significance was projected into certain lines of latitude, perhaps liturgical latitudes, that would perhaps suggest that was intentional? Or do you think the fact that Glasgow Cathedral and Roslin Chapel lie in the same latitude is pure luck?
Well, the fact that he took his architect to Glasgow and presumably took measurements and things, and therefore set his own out to be exactly the same. So it was intentional on his part, but not on any greater part, I wouldn't have thought. So I'll give you a 0 for that.
A naught?
Yes, I think so.
Would an architect not talk to an architect in Glasgow Cathedral and just replicate the shadow of the...
Oh, yes. But I mean, yes, I'm saying that the builder of Roslin Chapel had the intention of replicating it, but that doesn't make the replication anything other than it's being replicated by a modern architect.
Yes.
It wasn't. I don't think it was decreed that it should be that, other than in the mind of the builder, the mind of the sponsor for Roslin Chapel.
Fabulous. So you give me a 0 on that. That's great. Kenny Brophy was close to 0 too. There is a definite dopamine hit you get when you connect a line of things on a map. There's a reward that one gets, and you can get really addicted to that. Now, Ian, the idea that they aligned to the dedicated saint, that is beautiful. I want to tell people that happened more than you did a damn paper debunking it.
Well, I'm afraid you can't. So it's one of those things that I would have been happy if it had been true, if it had been provable to be true. And it's not something I was trying to debunk particularly, other than some of the people who, one of the papers published not long before mine, looking at monastic churches, found that something like a quarter of them aligned with this sunrise of patronal saint. But they also found that 20% aligned with sunset of the patronal saint, 10% aligned with Easter, 10% aligned eastwards, and basically just about every church that he looked at aligned with something. And it really was going back to the 60s. Here's an alignment, it must be true.
Was this Ali Jason's work?
Yes.
Even the language choice, it had all the hallmarks of me at my late 20s.
Yeah. I mean, they might. I don't want to do Guy a disservice. I've never actually met him, but it does rather sound like they have the need to publish, and therefore they were publishing all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
As part of an academic program, you need the credits and all that sort of thing.
Publish or perish.
Yeah, luckily I never had to go through all that. So
You came in late to the academic world, did you?
very late after I retired. Yeah.
Could you tell my audience what it's like to retire and then go back to academia and to start learning again?
It's truly wonderful because you actually get to do what you want to do rather than what you had to do. No, don't get me wrong. I enjoyed my job, but I was made redundant at the same time. My father-in-law needed looking after, so my wife and I moved out of London to a nice small village in East Anglia. Went to university. I'd always had an interest in landscape history and vernacular architecture, so it sort of progressed from there, a diploma and then an MA, then a PhD, then a bit of teaching, and now I'm properly retired.
What did your folks do for a living back in the day?
My father was a personnel manager. My mother was a librarian.
So you got involved with walking around the countryside seeking dragon lines. Are you sure that because you suckered for that you weren't out to prove something in your later years? Because I do now have, when I see someone with dowsing rods, I want to stop and tie them in a knot around their neck, because I got quite suckered for a long time with all these things, quite misleaded me from some of the fascinating subjects I'm involved in now in the temporal world. You sure all this isn't a rejection to your own beliefs in your 20s?
Yes, I am sure. I mean, it was great fun then, and it was a chance to get out and smoke some dope in the field and all that sort of stuff that went on in then. But no, now I'm not. I wasn't trying to disprove it. As I said, I would have been quite happy if the research had come up and showed that there was an element of alignment to patronal saints' days. It wouldn't have worried me at all if that had come up. I was actually quite open-minded about the whole result.
Has anybody conducted this type of research in any other European countries?
There's quite a lot of it in the Balkans. I get references through academia from a woman and a chap, both through writing in Balkans, but it tend to be small samples. There have been some studies in Spain, in Catalonia particularly.
What do they find?
Well, they do tend to find alignments quite often. Not always, but I think it depends who the researcher is, as always.
I live in a country that 96% are Catholic, and I can see in archaeoastronomy and in any studies relating to cathedrals or churches the bias that comes inherent with that. It's quite intense at times, and you have to forgive it, but yeah, it's fascinating observation that the closer you get to Rome, the more alignments are found with saints' days, right?
Which is why it surprises me that the papal aid in the 13th century, Durandus, didn't find significance or didn't mention papal saintly alignments. I mean, if it had been even vaguely thought of, he would have mentioned it, because as I said, he found significance in every aspect of church buildings, service, liturgy, everything, but not in the alignment of the church. And it didn't really come into the forefront of people's minds until the ecclesiologists of the mid-19th century got hold of it, the Cambridge Camden Society, and they sort of took it forward. They instigated their members to go out and do sunrise alignment checks on churches and things. But again, they only proved it to themselves. They didn't prove it to anyone else.
Have you found any interesting outliers in your research? For example, in Khmer, Cambodia, 99% of the churches are oriented within 10 degrees of the equinox to the north, but they did find one that was 47 degrees to the east, and it created a big question, and it turned out it was aligned to where the zenith sun rises, which was an enormously important day, the day with no shadows that occurs in the tropics.
Ah, right.
It's a sacred day. I see it in the garden. It's amazing. You're out there with a shovel and you'll get a fright.
There's no shadow.
Because something's wrong. You're not quite sure what it is. And then you get a jump and realize, oh my goodness, it's virtually right above me. And it's 11:15, on a couple of days before the zenith day. And you start to see that. But my point was, I was interested if there were any outliers as such in English church alignment, something that's much further to the north, to the south than the greater data set.
There is one church in Bedfordshire, which I'm just trying to find it here. Where are we? Which is aligned at 38 degrees, which is 8 degrees more northerly than any other church.
Yeah.
But there's no restriction in the site. It's on quite a big site. They could have pointed it anyway.
What have you decided that aligns to?
Nothing.
Come on.
Well, nothing specific. I mean, there is no sunrise to align it to, and there's no local. Bedfordshire is fairly, well, not flat, but doesn't have mountain peaks that you'd be choosing to align to. And why would one single church be aligned to a local feature when others apparently aren't?
Right, okay. I asked you quite. I think I worded it wrong because I asked you what does it align to. Your answer was nothing. I should have said what might it have aligned to. But I'll give you an example of what might be going on just to open this back up again. In the north of Scotland, in Helmsdale, where my dad was born, there's a church called the Loth Church, and it was built by the Duke of Sutherland, who conducted the Highland clearances. It was his personal church.
It was 19th century.
A 19th century church. So I figured out on the map what might be going on here, and I researched. I found his birthday. And what's a thing of beauty, when you stand at the altar in the church and look out, the sun sets behind this mountain straight ahead. It has a 300-foot statue of himself on it. So his church is aligned to where the sun sets on his birthday, and when he died, the statue was built on that point. So what if your outlier was aligned to where the church builder's birthday was, or where the sun rose on the day he died, perhaps?
But again, this comes back to the problem of when the church was actually built, and therefore when the alignment was originally set. Because the stone churches that we see in small villages today aren't the first church on that site. In almost every case, there would have been a small wooden church, timber church, earth-fast posts, the typical tiny little church. In some cases where excavations have been carried out, like at Warren Percy, the old post holes for the original church can be found inside the middle of the nave.
Oh, really?
Are they on exactly the same alignment? It's very difficult to tell. And what happens to all the churches where you can't find the post holes? Certainly some of the larger churches, some of the cathedrals like York Minster and others, there is a difference between the earlier Saxon version and the later Norman version. The Norman versions tend to be closer to east.
Okay.
But so that was intentional, but quite what the original intention was when the Saxons laid it out, we'll never know.
Has anybody applied this study, or this type of study, to the cathedrals of England as a data set?
No, is a short answer.
Because they must have had much more architectural nuances involved in their design.
Yes, I mean, the perfect example is York Minster, which is exactly due east.
Okay.
And it's at 38 degrees difference from the local street pattern because of the Roman grid, the street pattern in York. And St Michael Belfry, which is the church on High Petergate, which is right next door to it, is 38 degrees differently aligned from aligned at 128, which is following the pattern of the Roman streets.
Oh, really?
Yeah. When York Minster was built, it was studiously put due east, very different from the way the town was aligned. Town of York.
So that does suggest architectural intentionality for cardinal direction.
Yes. Then yes. Whether it does for others, I don't know. I haven't measured them, and I don't think anyone else has. There's a very small sample. That's the problem.
Have you come across churches that have been used as calendars? Have you found any that are oriented with cardinality for calendrical purposes?
No, in fact, again, quite the opposite.
Okay.
There are churches in Italy which they do have an equinoctial line down through the church and a small hole in the south wall of the church for the sun to shine on. This is so they can calculate when the equinox is and therefore when Easter should be. And some of them are 45 degrees different from the axis of the church, and some of them are closer, some of them are further away. So, and they're Roman churches too.
That's great. So this idea that churches were used as some kind of calendar house, so as many Buddhist and Hindu temples and Mesoamerican pyramids certainly were. You don't need a church to tell when the equinox is that what you're saying? You need a hole.
Well, ironically, they used the church to establish these things, but not in line with the church. The church was already built, and it was built on a different alignment.
Mm-hmm.
Let me think. There's a couple of very good examples. Large churches. One's in Pisa, I think. I'm just trying to find.
Yeah, take your time.
Of course, when you want to find a picture, you can't.
And 2 buses come when you don't need them.
Here, we do get a lot of buses here, which is excellent. This is why we moved to Norwich from the small village. But
you see, you're in the city now.
We're on the edge of Norwich.
Okay.
Not in the city. We're on the edge of the marshes on the river south of Norwich.
If you go back and do it again, would you do this type of archaeological work in your 20s much earlier, knowing what you know now?
Yes, and I've actually satisfied myself that I've come to an end. I'm pretty sure that if I added more to the sample, it wouldn't change the results. I'm pretty sure that it might alter it slightly, but I think the fundamental has been shown that there is a common alignment for almost all churches, and that's eastwards. There is some variation across the country, which I hope I've explained, because it's not magnetic. It's not to do with the changing sun. It's not to do with anything else, which might determine the way a church was laid out.
That's your legacy, because what you're essentially doing is not only saying this traditional belief that churches were aligned with the dedicated saints is shite. You're replacing it and saying, however, the data also suggests that climate and weather is what affected this more. That's quite a mark to leave.
It's one of the things which, at the time it first started coming to me, I thought, that looks interesting. So the analysis continued, and more appeared, and I thought, well, it seems to be pointing that way, but I'm never going to convince anybody. But in fact, I did. So I was quite pleased with that in the end. I convinced my supervisor, my external examiner, who was Professor Richard Morris.
So it's peer-reviewed.
Oh, yeah. And the article that this talk is about was peer-reviewed by Professor John Blair, and it's meant to be blind reviewed, but he contacted me afterwards saying, keep up the good work, sort of thing. So I was quite pleased with that.
Yeah, I think one of the strongest parts of your research is where so many are tempted to fill and to fluff and to puff. Yours was a work of refinement. You could see that you had, every word had fought for a space on the page.
I've never really been a great writer, but in fact I went 34,000 words over my 100,000 word limit for my thesis.
Wow.
Because I've always worked in sort of not mathematical jobs. I've been doing projections and other stuff with figures, so most of my work has been with figures. Hence, I've analysed everything to death, basically, every possible variation I put together, just to tease out if there was a meaning. But
have you ever tried to recreate the processes of the builders? For example, a few years ago, I found myself one afternoon with a bunch of garden canes and strings, ropes, and I was in the garden trying to pull alignments, and I was trying to set my corners, and it's a much more difficult job than you would believe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Being on your own to do it's hard, because it seems to be that with every 2 eyes that you add to it, you don't just get double the accuracy, it amplifies by 10, whereby 5 people, 5 astronomers, taking an alignment, the average of those 5 is going to be quite accurate, but it's incredible how inaccurate one person doing it is.
But most of the small rural churches were built presumably by small rural builders, and that's fairly obvious. If you look at an accurate drawing of a floor plan of a church, a good proportion of them have walls that aren't parallel. Mm-hmm. We've done a parallel survey looking at the arcades and piers of Norfolk's churches, and they're set out quite accurately, but not exactly accurate.
Okay.
And that's much later, and they're still making variations of a few centimetres here, there, and everywhere, and walls not being parallel. And so, yes, your statement about it being difficult to set out an alignment is absolutely true.
There's also invisible variables when you're trying to do such things, whereby we built a house here, Ian. I've said this story a few times, but it's so relevant here. 2 years ago, we built this little log cabin. We got a plot, and when it came to orientating the building, I had to do it for the builders because I had to tell them exactly where I wanted my house. And not only did that change 8 times within the net, once I had signed it off and said, that's it, it changed as I realised such and such was wrong. But see, when it came to the day of laying the stilts up for this house, I panicked. We've got this beautiful, it's called La Peña de Huayca, a mountain in front of us, and the sun sets behind it on the equinox. I had this whole thing figured out. I'm going to sacrifice to the left of the hill a bit. It won't set behind the tip. It'll be just there in the dip, the elaborate to the left. And then I caught it out the right of my eye. I could see lights from houses at the base of the hill about 4 miles over to the right. So I just went 5 degrees round, boys, and build it.
Turn it around.
That kind of human irrationality must have influenced church design as well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and it does come back to this whole thing about who was it who actually set the alignment in the first place? Was it the patron who wanted the church built in this particular place? Was it the builder? In which case, where did he get his instruction from? Because for all this thing about masonry and all that, there was no masonic control that early on because most of the churches were built in timber. So this isn't the workings of a particularly strong guild or anything. This is, in many cases, it'd just be local people.
I think it was 1572 when William Shaw published the Shaw Statutes, which formalised masonry and gave them a representation when dealing with bent nobles who tried to screw over the teams of masons. And there seems to be a formalisation of architecture in Scotland then, for sure. But prior to that, I think it's every man for his own. Who's the best builder?
Yeah, and I'm sure there were things that got passed on, well, obviously from master to apprentice and all the rest of it, but whether they were the same rules that each master passed on to their apprentices or whether they were slightly different ones, we'll never know.
8 years ago, I published a book called A Twist in Time. And what I did was, I found that by going out and standing with sticks and ropes that your greatest enemies are not the stones, it's the ropes. What I discovered was any rope will stretch or swell on any given day by 3 or 5 degrees depending on humidity and heat. Everybody pulls a knot tighter than the next man. Everybody pulls a rope tighter than the next man. So I realised that going all the way back to the Neolithic, there existed an entire, almost an industry of rope production and calibration technologies, because to have monuments accurate to a degree of accuracy, so too must the ropes have been, and you can't just twist twine and do that. So
yeah,
I found that by looking at the production of ropes and the fact that a measuring staff can represent, depending on how far you are from it, it might represent 10 degrees on the horizon.
Yeah.
And then when you come back, things start to get even less accurate. So that's, I think, the secrets of masonry, is how to square and how to make sure all these variables are as tight as they can be. And not so much of the stuff that's associated with Freemasonry today, this pop cultural hijacking of the stone Masonic tradition, I call it.
I'm sure most of the stuff that was passed on was just technique. But how you pass on the ability to see things in 3 dimensions and to work out how you have to shape stuff in order to achieve what you want, that is something which is far more difficult. And it is outside the parameters of what Freemasonry is talking about anyway.
The building of Cologne Cathedral in Germany, fortunately, there's lots of Masonic documents relating to that building, and the entire focus is placed on the vertical extrapolation of spires and manipulating squares and circles. Now, Freemasonry today has lots of symbols with circles and squares, but I bet you You'll not find many Freemasons that'll tell you about its origins in the building of Cologne Cathedral, where they really tried to build secure, stable buildings using shapes. It's not to do with the esoteric power that's associated with the damn shape. It's the practical function of the Mason who needed to know the importance of 45 degrees, where if someone comes along to try and build something and doesn't know that simple number and its importance in a square, they're stuck. Their building's falling over.
There is quite a lot of research done on the basis comparing the buildings with the shapes of squares and circles, and this fits into that, and that extends something else. I mean, again, it's rather like going back to the alignments thing. It's finding a shape that fits, and therefore that must have been how it was done, rather than just happens to fit that shape.
Yeah, and there's lots of knowledge of, I call them, again, not for any dramatic reason, but they are truly invisible forces. So aside the invisible force of stretching ropes is the force of thrust dynamics, whereby church builders knew the Roman arch creates downward thrust. When they created the upward pointing Arabic arch, or the Ogi arch, the pointed arch, it creates an upward thrust, and it enabled them to build thinner walls with more light space above it.
Yeah.
That secret is worth its weight in gold in the 15th century, to know that.
Yeah.
Because you can go to the patron and say, here's our proposal, we're going to build this, but because of this secret right here, we can cut the costs.
Yeah. There is quite a lot of discussion about, certainly with local parish churches, about who it was who was in control. If you had a big mason working from the bench at the local cathedral, then I'm sure they were in control. But I'm sure the patron had a lot to say about, because there are contracts where you see, we want a tower like the neighbouring village, only taller.
Yeah.
Or we want windows like the neighbouring village but bigger. So there's a lot of comparative stuff done. It wasn't entirely in the purview of the mason himself. He had to do what he was told to some extent, unless he was a top man.
You see that in civil architecture in 19th century Glasgow, where you've got three core people who built Glasgow on the back of the tobacco industry. But when you see
Greek revival,
you've got it. My goodness, is that worth a walk through? But what I find is fascinating is there's instances there where the primary building of one, when you compare it with the next built his 1 foot higher than the previous, and then the third guy's half a foot higher than that.
Yeah. But it's all competitive. It's the money from the patron, basically.
Yeah.
Coming back to Victorian things, though, I mentioned earlier on about how Victorian churches weren't aligned in the same way as medieval churches.
Yeah.
Basically, they are. They're on average, they're slightly further north, aligned slightly further north. But rather than being a variation of 90 degrees between the most northerly and the most southerly, it's a variation of 230 degrees. So the most northerly aligned church is aligned west of north.
Why?
Because of restrictions to the site. It got to the stage where they didn't care about east. And the one which is most southerly aligned is 20 to 25 degrees to the west of south. And it aligns directly with the vicar's house, which was built at the same time.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's lovely.
I mean, there are other churches which are built, obviously, on beginning of restricted sites, which is why I concentrated mostly on rural ones, because you get less restriction. You don't end up with the town street pattern, which you have to comply with and all that sort of thing.
Do you never see completely malaligned just because they're fitting into a available town square?
You do in Victorian churches.
You do.
Victorian churches, yes. And in fact, there's a couple. I mean, I didn't do many urban churches because of that possible problem. But there's one church in Hastings where the bottom corner of the chancel has been cut off because of the street. So it's fitted into the street pattern. They built it as east facing as they could, but had to lop a bit off the bottom corner to fit it in.
Do you know they're so obsessed here in Colombia with this notion of east and church orientation that if a church is built in a community and they haven't got any options to face east, to orient to east, or if it's significantly off it, it's not known as a church, it's known as a shrine. It doesn't meet chapel or church category, and that's why the Andean world is full of shrines. And over where you are, you don't have Christian shrines as such. We have churches and holy wells.
Yeah, well, we have lots of so-called holy wells, most of which aren't, and we do have shrines around the pilgrim sites like Walsingham and places like that.
Love what you said about holy water. 20 years ago, when I was going through those moments where I was thinking, so what if there are curative waters in all these holy wells? So I took a sample from a famous holy well called the Clootie Well beside Dingwall in the north of Scotland, and it's famous because people have been tying rags from deceased children.
Yes, I know it.
You know it. So I took a sample and I sent it to Dr. Brian Lamb at Caithness Horizons. He came back to me 3 weeks later and he says, quite a unique sample here you have here, Ash. He goes, really, really high in iron content, but frighteningly high in nitrogen content. He says, this is one of the dirtiest agricultural soups I have ever seen.
Iron, you get a lot of iron in wells in churchyards. I mean, there are several, especially in Wales, a lot of springs and so-called wells in churchyards, and they're all, whatever the term is, chaly something, iron rich, very iron rich. Water comes out rust coloured.
We experienced it here. We have a well in the garden and the plants hate it. Far too many heavy metals. And the iron, last year, a farmer next door plumbed into the well and put the well water on a sprinkler. He had this kind of off-white, tan-coloured white farmhouse. Within 4 weeks, it was bright orange like a mandarin.
Rusty.
The iron completely. And I wonder if people noticed that with surrounding stones in prehistory and in medieval times and associated with transformation or change. Magic.
It's magic. Yeah, absolutely. The other thing about Victorian alignment, or at least their the fact that they moved away from alignments. There's one church on the Solway Firth in Cumbria. It was quite a squat shape, a strange shape. And in Victorian times, they turned the nave round. So instead of the nave being east-west, they now face all their seats north-south because it's wider than it is long. So it's a more practical way of using it.
That's altogether a bit sacrilegious almost.
Well, it is if you're a Catholic, perhaps, but not if you're a Church of Scotland obviously doesn't think so.
Theme that we have is wherever possible, we try to debunk pop cultural ideas.
Yep.
You've done that just perfectly, especially with giving me my 0 on my Glasgow Cathedral Equinox alignment. Kenny Brophy's going to laugh.
Will you broadcast that?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
You're not going to edit this?
No way. No, I got a 0 out of 10. I love that because it shows that I'm not full of shit. All right, I would be saying all the best stuff that I know you would agree with, you know?
Yes, that's true. Yes, I can understand that. My conclusions to the whole study were that medieval churches do face generally eastwards. East does appear the main focus rather than anything else, because otherwise there would be variations around other directions if there was any other influence. That's boosted by the fact that when chancels were rebuilt after the Lateran Council of 1215, because of the change in liturgical requirements and more space required and everything else, 75% of the chancels are built closer to east than the nave of the church. Where there's a misalignment, they are closer to east. So east was obviously still an important focus then. None of the various suggestions about reasons for this, either saintly sunrise or days of setting out or Easter or facing Jerusalem, hold water at all.
Okay.
But as I said, there does appear to be an explanation that can be derived from climate and weather. I'd like to see further work done on that to either prove or disprove it. But as I say, I didn't think that I could add more to my sample in order to be able to improve that or not. So the questions really are, when churches were set out, was it, if in the 9th and 10th century, was the belief then the same as it is in later times? There is some thought that the end of the first millennium worried people a lot, and they thought the world was going to end, rather like Y2K, but only much worse. The fact that so therefore you had to shrieve yourself and all the rest of it before the end of the first millennium. So whether there was a different set of beliefs then or not, I don't know, and I don't know how we can ever know that. There are also problems with rededication of churches. Apart from some churches being rededicated because the patron wanted it, there were other churches where after the Reformation the knowledge of the dedication was lost completely, and antiquarians of the 18th century found some dedications which they said applied to these churches, but it can be shown that some of those were actually to either side altars in the church or some other saint that was associated with the church, not necessarily the original dedication of the church. So that's one of the reasons why I do very little with the alignment of individual church dedications, because there is some clue that they might not all be true. All these things cancel each other out when you look at them all together, apart from the variation across the country.
But within that, would you agree or disagree that there's 2,000 in your data set? Well, you've just explained your findings. There must have been at least one or two or three church funders, builders or patrons who did say, let's align it to the horizon where the sun rises on the day of the dedicated saint. Or do you say it was absolutely non-existent?
No, you can't say that.
No.
You can't say it was non-existent. I mean, it's very possible that some patrons decided they wanted to face sunrise. The difficulty is, one thing we haven't discussed, which I should perhaps have raised, again, to try and isolate out the possible variations of dedication changes and that sort of thing, looking at saints that were have summer sunrise dates or saints that have winter sunrise dates, the average alignment of those two groups of churches is the same, within a degree. And yet sunrise is 90 degrees apart. So I think you can be fairly certain that didn't happen. There are a few churches that actually match their sunrise exactly, but I think that's probably more chance than anything else. I mean, you've yourself said how difficult it is to set out something accurately, even with modern equipment. Even my compass is only plus or minus 1 degree. So to be within plus or minus 1 degree in 1200 or 900 or whenever, I would think was pretty near impossible.
I think the biggest misinterpretation placed into alignment dynamics is the fact that people were looking to where the sun rose or set. You know, there is one fact I've discovered is there never in history has anybody looked at the sun when making an alignment. You can't look at the sun on the horizon when it's rising.
No.
Because not only does it make all of your tools in front of you invisible, there's heat rises off the ground. Everything distorts in so many ways. The people of prehistory must have been observing the shadows created rather than what the sun's doing.
Yeah.
The focus must have been on drawing ropes from shadows rather than this idea of looking at a sun rising on the horizon. And that's a conceptual opposite.
All of those things will introduce inaccuracies as well. So that's another reason why you're never going to be very perfectly accurate, and which is why I'm pretty sure that if there is a church which is absolutely accurate, it's a mistake or luck or whatever rather than intention.
In Khmer, Cambodia, they used a device known, perhaps inappropriately now, but known as an Indian compass. And what they did was they created a circular bowl of water and they filled it with sand. So the sand found a perfect level with water. Mm-hmm. And in that they would put their gnomon and they would observe the shadows created. Now, on a clear morning, that shadow can look as sharp as a pin. If there's any mist in the air at all, the shadow diffuses and covers between 6 and 9 degrees on the mark.
Yep.
So, do you know the complexities of getting that right, even if it's leveled with water?
Yep.
There's so much that goes wrong between laying a brick and monitoring a shadow.
Yep.
And I think that's what your work's doing, is you're showing the human tendency for inaccuracy.
The village I lived in the Waveney Valley had always been very poor. It never had a lord of the manor.
Okay.
The church was probably built by a group of freemen, probably themselves, between harvest and ploughing and that sort of thing. And I can't believe that they knew anything about compasses, or indeed they knew anything about how to set out a church, other than they had I'm sure they'd been led to believe that it had to face east or eastwards.
I don't know about this compass idea, Ian. I mean,
Yeah.
I think compass would be an exceptionally inaccurate way of doing it.
And as far as I know, the first reference the church in England ever made to the compass was in the 12th century. I mean, I appreciate that the Vikings had a primitive form of compass, and I'm sure the Chinese did centuries before us. But I don't think there was any use of a compass. Certainly, possibly amongst the people who lived near the coast might have had, say, people who fished and sailed and all that sort of thing. But for a poor village inland, I'm sure they'd never even appreciated that a compass existed.
And the compass, for a greater part of medieval history, was associated as being a tool of the deil. The magnetic compass needle being the tool of the witch or associated with witchcraft.
Yeah. What you can't explain is to be feared. Most people have got one on their phone these days, but they're not that accurate.
No, they're not.
And the signal's always weak, so you have to do the old figure of 8, waving it about and things. But I was just looking at, I've got a table here which shows that 19% of all churches are within 15 degrees of their Saint's Day sunrise. That's 15 degrees. 19%. Plus or minus 15 degrees.
There's not even a tease of deliberation in that.
No. So it's 19% for within 15 degrees, plus or minus 15 degrees of east, whereas 80%, of Saint's Day sunrise, whereas 80% are within plus or minus 15 degrees of east. And the counter to that is that 50% of churches are more than 30 degrees away from their sunrise. It's a half, whereas only 2% of churches are more than 30 degrees away from east. So, I mean, it all comes down to this same thing, that east must have been the focus. Quite how they got there and quite how accurate they were in doing it, it'll be going to vary church by church and builder by builder.
So your predecessor, Ali Jason, suggested that 43% of the churches that he studied showed a significant correspondence with sunrise on Easter morning of the year of foundation.
33 aligned with the sunrise on the day of their patronal saint. I'll go through all of them, actually, because it's interesting. 28 were aligned with patronal saint's day sunset. 37 Easter sunrise. 25 were orientated east-west. 12 were aligned with magnetic east. 5 were aligned for topographical reasons. Quite what that means, I don't know. And 31 were aligned with Julian calendar dates. But there's no consideration of why 31 were aligned with Julian calendar dates, but 50-odd were aligned with non-Julian calendar dates, when obviously they were built before the calendar changed. And that only left 15 with no alignment out of 143.
Okay. So have there been any works around yours that have argued what you've said? Has anybody said, hang on a minute?
Not that I've seen, but then the whole point of doing such a huge study that I did was to make it so that you'd have to do the same sort of size study in order to be able to disprove it.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that. Like I started thinking I was going to be smart and saying to you, so if you're seeing indication that climate, or rather weather, affected church building from one side of a country to the other by as much as 10 degrees, I was going to say to you, wouldn't you have to then do a study of churches that might have been aligned to bad harvests? And then I slapped myself in the face and went, hang on a minute, Ash.
Why would you?
Who's doing that?
Yes.
So I've kind of looked around different ways that you could maybe counter or contrast, but I think yours works quite bulletproof the way it's been presented.
I mean, there might be another reason. I'm not saying that this is the reason. It's just that this seems to explain the particular differences between the West and the East, in that if it was something really to celebrate this early harvest, because we forget, that if they didn't have a good harvest, they might not make it through the winter.
Yep.
And their animals certainly wouldn't make it through the winter. So it's actually a really good reason to celebrate. Apart from anything else, the Lord of the Manor is going to get more in tithes that year, so everybody benefits.
Yeah. There's South American cultures here, and anthropologists are recently starting to see that the interpretation's been wrong, where it's always been assumed they celebrated the beginning of the wet season for all the glory that begins. There's evidence to suggest that the bigger celebration at that time was on the end of that dry season.
Dry season, yeah.
We got through another year.
I can understand that. Yes, I mean, what about the crop growing side? Does that not start until the wet season starts, or?
They do their cloning and they prepare the seeds. They do all the magic rites that happen to seeds from the 22nd of February until the equinox. And when the equinox turns, that's when they're waiting for the perfect moment to plant. And that's indicated by the first rainfall, which happens in the first week of April, to the clock. And even this year, where the entire world's suffering El Nino effect, the dry effect, we were still just a week off on the rainy season at equinox.
Really?
Uh-huh.
So are they planting the seeds before the rain starts, so they germinate after it rains, or do they wait until it rains?
Plant on the first rain, but then everything's ready. And when that soil gets wet, that's when the seeds go in, but they get 2 harvests a year here, Ian.
Presumably it won't germinate if it's not wet.
That's right, but the seeds will be getting germinated from the equinox for that first 2 weeks, that last 2 weeks before they're planted. They'll be getting exposed to water, and so all this happened, and then bang, the rain happened, and in it goes, and it happens on the Christian Holy Week, Easter week. So when the conquistadors arrived in 1537, they didn't have much of a job transplanting the indigenous myths with the new Christian system. You see it beautifully behind our house. There's a church on the hill. It's lined directly with the mountain across, which is an equinox alignment from that church. And when the sun sets on the equinox, you see it sinking behind that mountain. But in the 14th century, there was a moon temple, a temple for lunar astronomy there, dedicated to the goddess Chia, the triple moon goddess. The Christians came along, and what you find are all of the moon temples associated to the indigenous feminine principle are dedicated to Mary. All of her varieties, Maria de Lourdes, Maria de Guadalupe, there's 12. But you find the sun temples that were associated to male indigenous principles, those are where the largest white male dedicated churches are.
And they're probably more important.
Though those are the central churches in the plazas that were built over the indigenous burial sites. The female churches are the satellite rural chapels in the hillside, as you've just suggested.
Peripheral, yes. Things don't change wherever you are, do they?
No, it speaks of the transition from reverence in a central lunar goddess who controlled agriculture here to the worship of the new feminine goddess. What I do when I'm looking to map indigenous temples here is you open an environment and you plot the Christian churches that were built in the 16th century. They always cap or were built upon central temples.
So how much did the Spaniards actually bring in terms of culture, in terms of you talk about agriculture being governed by the Christian calendar, and obviously it wasn't beforehand, it was the lunar calendar, presumably before conquistadors arrived. But how different is it?
They had a calendar based on the 10 fingers and the 10 toes. So 20 moon months was their holy year, 37 moon months was their priestly year, so that everything was structured around the cycles of the moon. The Christian calendar is based on solar geometry. So the Muiscas, for example, their 13 lunar months a year was significant, but it was nowhere near as holy and sacred as their 37 moon months.
Yeah.
But the Christians reset and restart every year.
It's a prime number, 37. It's interesting.
You can correlate the Muisca calendar to so many calendrical systems, but also really deeply esoteric systems as well. The numbers associated with the lunar astronomy are beautiful, and the way the culture worked here is they didn't worship one moon goddess. They worshipped a triple moon goddess, one for each of the 3 monthly phases. Waitaka was the young, rebellious, drunken goddess, and that's the waxing moon. And then Chia was the fertile moon goddess, the pregnant goddess of the moon, representing fertility and abundancy. She was the full moon, and then the waning moon was represented by Bachwe, when the moon transferred into the earth goddess. Each was worshipped in a different temple with a different set of values and principles, and there was an exceptionally culturally interactive aspect of it, where everybody from priest to farmer was involved in what was passing overhead each night. And from 1537, when the first church got built in the center of Bogota, no longer did farmers depend on lunar astronomy. They just depended on the word of the bishop. That process was taken by the rulers of the Christian church. So all of the shamanic class and the people who could predict seasons and climate change and weather fronts, they were run out of Dodge. They were eradicated here within the first 3 years of conquest. 200 Spaniards eradicated 2.2 million Muiscas in 3 years.
Yeah.
But the first was the shaman class. And that got rid of the magic. That got rid of the dependency on them for farming. So the Catholics, Jimenez Quesada, decimated indigenous culture at whole by attacking the priestly class, not the rulers. The rulers came second. It was get the priests out of the way, and there's a state of chaos ensues.
Did it actually have that much effect? Because if you look at religion and the way John Blair's described Christian religion in England in the 16th, 17th century as being a crust on top of popular culture. And popular culture was witchcraft, spirits, which means you need all sorts of protective apotropaic devices in your houses to keep the spirits out and that sort of thing. And yet everyone was Catholic, and it sort of sits on top of it. So I wonder how much of the lunar element carried on at a personal level.
The lunar sites were described in Spanish records as diabolical.
Yeah, I understand that, but when people ran their lives, if they had always planted their seeds based on the lunar calendar, did they carry on doing that because it also fitted the solar calendar, or did they actually pick up the new regime completely?
It's hard to know what a Spaniard arriving in Colombia would do, and what the second generation, the criollos, the second generation of conquistadors here, what they did. They brought Jews with them on the boats to take care of the astronomy to get here, but they also brought master agriculturalists. And they didn't record what each of them did agriculturally, but it would be accepted that they would have found them, even the masters from Europe would have found themselves out of their depth.
Absolutely.
In such a hydraulically different climate and environment.
The southern European climate is very dry, isn't it? I mean, it's not, you don't get rainy seasons like that sense.
And there's a specific element here that must have been huge. In the high Andes, in the wet season at night, the humidity is so high that all of the crops start to get blue powder and funguses that you don't see in Europe. So they came across that for sure. And I think they would have adopted most of the systems of the indigenous people here.
Yeah.
An important thing about lunar astronomy, which you're going to like because it's a 0 out of 10, is while even, like, I read professors who talk about the effect that the moon has on agriculture and crops, because they say it alters the tides, we can see that, so therefore it alters the water table in crops. Ian, it's just rubbish. The truth is, every indigenous farmer here will tell you, we film with the indigenous community at the Sesquil Muisca community, and they tell us that the moon offers the farmer this ability, and I use it myself. It's, if you plant a seed on the full moon, most plants you can decide need 8 weeks, 12 weeks, or 16 weeks to flower. You can gauge them in blocks. So it's so handy to say, look, I popped it in the full moon.
Month to month, yeah.
You can travel around your estate and you just know this field was done then. So you know by the turn of 2 full moons that you'll be looking for the final signs of flowering, if they need more of this or adjustment for that.
Yeah.
So it's an excellent way to record passing time, the cycle of the moon from full to new. And there just doesn't seem to be any effect that the moon had. Like in us, we're a closed system, like the stalk of a plant. We're not like the tides on the earth. Our water table doesn't go up with the moon. But there is no question at all that the indigenous people projected an entire sacred aspect to the moon associated with her power to fertilize. It was always associated to fertilization.
Why wouldn't you? I mean, if you've only got to look at it, and these things happen based on a lunar cycle, so that must be cause and effect.
Yeah, it's really interesting that, because, as you can imagine, in all ancient cultures, not many people in ancient cultures got to the age of 18 and went and told everybody, we've decided not to have kids.
Yes.
There was one end if you said that. So they timed everything, as you said, specifically on when is the optimum moment to try and be fertile. For example, the Zipa of Bakata travelled to the Termalis up the valley in Tabio here once a year.
Yeah.
The Zipa swam in the Termalis for 3 days with 211 virgins. The waters from the Termalis flow down the El Rio Chico and fertilize the entire valley.
Wow.
That's how focused they were on fertilization around the equinox.
This is just adding blood into the water.
Tell you now, I don't go near it now. My wife says, let's take our child up for a swim in the Termales. And I said, you absolutely kidding me? I'm not going near the damn thing. The dry season was symbolized by lizards and the wet season was represented by frogs. And there's an entire cosmology, they call it Moiska cosmovision, associated with the moon and fertility. And of course, the male aspect had its entire set of principles relating to fertility too. But where the moon was the controller of all fluid aspects, the male principle, Bochika, her husband, the sun god, was the controller of direct, straight male influences. But bringing them both together, silver and gold, the moon and the sun, they deposited. Well, the Spaniards recovered 600 tons of silver and gold from the lagoons of Colombia, and they think that represents 5% of what's out there.
Is that all?
Yeah, we fly people here once a year, archaeologists, anthropologists, and we go treasure hunting, but it's non-intrusive archaeology because we use drones and stuff like that. We're not in there with dynamite and shovels, but we take people here and we go to the indigenous temples. We get permission from private landowners to search around, rummage around. I wish I had it here to show you. When my friend Walter 2 years ago discovered a 32-gram gold figurine of this goddess Chia that I was telling you about. She has triangles on her face representing the monthly cycle. She's pregnant. It's a thing of beauty. So Ian, I don't know how the hell we got from church alignments in England to fertility rituals and dirty termales in Colombia.
But we did.
The best ones always go like that. I'd asked you half my questions and I looked and it said 21 minutes and I froze and thought, you're in trouble here, Ash. Where's this going to go?
There's a couple of things still then. One, you said I could say where my research can actually be discovered. And apart from there's a couple of full texts on academia.edu, whatever they call themselves. But the final results were published in a British archaeological report in the British series number 540 in 2012, Aspects of the Alignment and Location of Medieval Rural Churches. The other thing I would urge people to read is the Leylines in Question by Tom Williamson. He debunks it with maths, the whole idea of leylines.
So, firstly, I will go and get links to those two pieces and put them on the show notes for this episode. But going back to what you just brought up there about debunking ley lines, I find that I know that a lot of people listening to this have origins in ley hunting. It was such a popular sport back there in the 70s and 80s.
Me too.
But what I find is there's a lot of people that have used that as a trampoline into much more academic disciplines and more rigorous research. So I'm glad that you brought that up. I'm glad you give my Glasgow Cathedral to Rosslyn a 0 out of 10. It's so refreshing because I asked it genuinely. It's a wonderful occurrence and there seems to be a cultural association, but that doesn't mean there was intentionality there.
No, and it's not medieval, and he went there with that aim by the sound of it.
Remember, I didn't find this line. I was told by a member of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, so who was I to doubt this guy? And he shows me the line on the map.
Yes.
So before I know it, that's not good enough for me. I'm calculating, wonder what the latitude distance to Jerusalem. By debunking these things, you learn so much about our tendency to kid ourselves to find patterns where they don't exist. Would you agree on that?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, that's certainly a lot of the work in the 60s on megalithic alignment seems to be there is an alignment here, therefore it must mean something. And that does seem to have been carried through in some of the church research, some of the research in the mid 20th century anyway.
Mm-hmm.
It is a bit worrying that some of these articles have been published in recognised journals, and yet they don't appear to have been peer reviewed very well.
I totally agree. I have a situation here, and I'm not going to get anywhere with it. For a whole tourist industry is built around a village called Villa de Leyva, a colonial Spanish village 100 miles north of here. It's full of churches and chapels, and there are some 2,000-year-old megalithic sites surrounding the village, and there are several really top batting professors in Columbia universities who have for 30 years been teaching about these megalithic sites and showing their astronomical significance on the horizon. 8 years ago, PhD student publishes a paper showing that every single one pointed towards where there was a channel of water coming down the local hill. He virtually shows there's no astronomical significance, but water was everything in that area because all around it's a desert and there's no water, and there water was so sanctified that these megalithic alignments pointed. So I emailed 2 of the 3 archaeoastronomers, one in Cali, one in Medellin, and asked them straight out if we could discuss this recent paper that suggests all the previous research is rubbish, and they won't email me back. I understand why, but that's dangerous stuff, 30 years of pounding an idea home, suggesting such deep astronomical and cosmological significance, and the things are pointed to streams of water.
And the worrying thing is that it's not just this particular aspect of research that's like that. There are people who hold senior positions in all sorts of disciplines who, until they stop working, nobody's going to be able to gainsay what they've said, because whilst they're still alive and working and presenting papers themselves, they're always going to be, oh, you can't say that because Professor so-and-so has already shown it to be the opposite.
I listened to a really big astronomy, not cultural astronomy podcast recently, and they had a lady on from a university in America. It's not fair to say her name. She was churning out these tropes like, last year Professor Magley showed that Stonehenge was never a chronometer. It was never designed to calculate time. And she was talking about how it's aligned to the solstice and it was used to calculate agricultural time. No, it wasn't. It was purely symbolic.
Yeah.
And repeating things like, she said, and the Nazca lines, they can only be seen from the air. So I wrote them an email saying, hang on, we need to address these ancient alien narratives you guys are talking about here, because the Nazca lines, almost all of them can be seen from surrounding hills. And Stonehenge clearly has a solstice alignment, but there's a higher chance it's nothing to do with the sunrise in the northeast, that people were walking on the processional way, the curses to it, and it's the southwest that was significant.
Yeah.
So that's at the highest level of American universities. And do you know why I think that happens, Ian? Is because some people get to the top of their own tree and they stop researching modern sciences on their subjects, and they get out of touch very quickly.
Yeah. And anybody who wants to gainsay them has to fight against the reputation of somebody who's been doing it for years. One of the things which came up looking at the location of churches was that it seems to be generally accepted that the senior church people wanted to put churches in places that argued against the old pagan religion, that Christianized them, some Christian substitution. And yes, there are 1 or 2 wells where a church has been built next to it, because baptism is fundamental to the church, so having running water would make sense. There are 1 or 2 places where a church has been built inside an old henge, like at Knowlton in Somerset, of Dorset. And yet the biggest stone circle at Avebury has the church built outside it, has a pub built in the middle of it.
Was that not previously a church?
No, No, I mean the whole point of Avebury's different in the fact there was a Saxon borough just outside the circle, and the church is built within the Saxon borough. That's why it's built there. But the fact that they didn't build it to suppress the obviously pagan intent of Avebury Stone Circle says a lot about the fact that, and this is, we're talking about 10th, 11th century here. They obviously didn't consider it important enough to do that.
It suggests the opposite, that perhaps there's a bunch of people who try to avoid the centres of those sites, which conflicts completely with the claims of the modern lay hunter, for example.
Yeah. Whereas the church seems to have been built next to the big house, which makes much more sense because the patron or the landowner at the time wanted convenience.
Yeah. And here, while I said to you that it's when I'm plotting indigenous temples, I need do no more than plot 16th century churches, I could also argue that the Christians built these churches here because the temples were on the dry high spots in the savannah here.
Yeah.
And there was already stones there, so
yeah.
You'd have to be a pretty orthodox conquistador to come across the Atlantic, risk life and limb coming into interior Colombia and going, you know what? Let's build churches a mile outside these pueblos. Let's move all the resources. Let's move all the people that we can enslave to do it. No, they did it to control society.
Yeah. Why would you choose a secondary site when you can use the primary site?
Yeah, indeed. I digress, Ian. I'm fluffing. We've got to the end of our core conversation, so I'd like to formally thank you genuinely for presenting a pretty dense data set is what you've got there. 2,000 sites, but you've cleared up so many cultural myths for the audience. That's what I thank you for, is clearing up cultural myths.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed the whole process. In fact, the 10 years of doing the survey work, and didn't quite enjoy the writing up quite so much. But
can you see any opportunities now with the birth of ChatGPT and artificial intelligence language models? Can you not get a student to take your data set and do some really creative interpretation of it?
Not using AI, but I have done such. I gave it to one of the maths professors at UEA where I took my PhD, and a professor from Australia asked if he could have a copy of the data so he could work on some other stuff on mapping and things. But both of them came back and said there doesn't appear to be much in it. Obviously, things have moved on since then, and as you say, AI will now. What worries me a little bit, maybe AI will find something just like the old days in the 60s, because there are alignments, they must mean something.
I think perhaps an application for your work is for someone to take it backwards and go, look, let's start with your conclusion that 10% discrepancy from east to west is climate related. And let's have a look and see how that climate influence might have affected timber circles or Neolithic henges.
Then you'd need to be able to know that what the climate was like in the Bronze Age and I know there are general rules that Bronze Age was warmer and drier and all that, but the ability that I had to say that the 19th century and the 11th century were very similar climatically was based on the work of Professor Lamb, and he had these graphs and things which showed that the two periods were very similar, so you can be reasonably sure that crops will germinate and harvest the same way, given on a climatic basis. It's the weather that affects it at a detailed level and brings some out of the sort of general pattern.
Okay, so that's the third time I've suggested something relatively smart and you've bat me down like a whack-a-mole. So on that note, Ian,
I didn't bat you down on it. I was, from a personal point of view, it's not something I'd be interested in doing, but I'd be happy if someone else did.
Yeah, for sure.
If someone else can make something else of my data, I'd be more than happy for them to have a go.
Maybe you could look at a collection of sites and derive climate data from the alignments of sites, perhaps, with enough data.
But that means going back 1,000 years, doesn't it?
Yeah, I said it was in my head. I wasn't actually going to say that again because it's just going to give you your fourth rebuff, and I'm not that strong. Ian, again, thank you for coming along. It was lovely, and what I'll do is send you a link to this when it's published, perhaps mid-February 24. It'll be 2 or 3 months, and it'll be out. So I'll send you a link, and you can get that around your group.
I have signed up for your podcast, but for the free version, so...
I was going to thank you for being my first Patreon, but then I thought, I'm not thanking anybody for taking the free option when there's a $4.99 a month there.
Yes, but I'm retired, you see, so... if I was actively researching still, then it's something that does sound quite interesting, I must admit.